The Allen Lund Company is celebrating 48 years in transportation. Stop by and see us at Matt's, booth 18193.
OOIDA, representing America's truckers since 1973, presents Landline Now with your host, Mark Redding.
What is the fuel of the future in the trucking industry? For some time, the government has been pressing for battery-driven electric trucks. Others have already moved on to the use of hydrogen-based fuel cells. But the Southwest Research Institute is looking into another alternative, hydrogen combustion. I'll discuss the organization's research with Dr. Thomas E. Briggs Jr. and Ryan Williams. Also on today's program, 6 states have been considering changes to their rules for idling by trucks and other vehicles. Scott Thompson talks with our state legislative expert, Keith Goebel. But first, the news with Scott Thompson.
Thanks, Mark. We begin with our weekly check on diesel prices. We'll start with the Energy Information Administration's weekly report, which has prices up nearly 2.5 cents last week to an average of $4.02. That reverses 3 weeks of declines on the survey, over which time prices had dropped by more than a dime. The modest gain last week was driven by price hikes in half of the 10 regions EIA tracks. The biggest increase was seen in the Gulf Coast, where prices were up more than 4 cents. We could be in for another drop in next week's EIA report, though. ProMiles.com, which updates its average diesel report each day, had Tuesday morning's average falling 1.5 cents to $3.89. That's compared to a week earlier. And prices were up in just one region on the ProMiles report, New England, where diesel was up just a cent. Averages were down in the other 9 areas of the country. A bipartisan effort in the House and Senate aims to streamline the security clearance process for transportation workers, including truck drivers. Current TSA policies often require separate applications for required credentials like the Transportation Worker Identification Credential and hazardous materials endorsements, even though TSA conducts a security threat assessment for each program. The Transportation Security Screening Modernization Act would standardize a TSA security clearance process. Senator Roger Wicker of Mississippi said in a news release that the bill will cut through the red tape and streamline the process so workers can get back to moving goods across America, not wasting time and money. The bill is now up for consideration in both houses of Congress after being introduced in the Senate. The House version was introduced back in September. Jennifer Homendy is staying on as chair of the National Transportation Safety Board. The White House announcing that President Biden intends to keep her on in her current position. Homendy has served on the NTSB board since 2018 and has been its chair since August of 2021. Spring has sprung, and market analysts are seeing the impacts of that on freight volumes across the country. Landline Now's Ashley Blackford explains.
The number of weekly load posts on DAT1 rose 3.57% last week, a good sign according to Robert Rouse, who says the market is moving in the right direction.
When we look at the overall strength of the spot market, there are a couple of trends that point towards good things as we move into spring. First, we've seen flatbed load post volume increase for the 7th week, following last week's 1% week-over-week gain. Spot market volumes have increased by about 21% in the last month, but freight moving in the spot market is just over 6% higher than last year for flatbeds. When we look at flatbed demand, the DAT's Market Condition Index shows the majority of the South, like Memphis, Houston, Dallas, with all tight capacity last week and projected to have tight capacity this week. Even with higher volume, we did not see a major impact on the national flatbed rates as they stayed flat from last week at $2.54 per mile with fuel. But in tight markets in the Southeast, we saw rates go up with that tighter capacity.
Rouse says as we close out March, we should expect similar load volumes until the produce season really starts to get underway in April. For Landline Now, I'm Ashley Blackford.
Thanks, Ashley. Kansas is mulling over a change to the way it collects fuel taxes. The state DOT is currently asking for volunteers for a pilot program that launches next month. It will test a pay-by-the-mile system. The road usage charge being floated is roughly 1 cent per mile driven. Volunteers for the pilot program won't actually be charged for now. They're just being asked to track their mileage for 3 months and to provide feedback. It's been more than 20 years since Kansas has changed its fuel tax rate, currently set at 24 cents a gallon for gas and 26 cents a gallon for diesel. Another split speed limit on another stretch of roadway is going away. The Louisiana Department of Transportation and Development says crews are in the process of replacing signage on the Interstate 10 Atchafalaya Basin Bridge. Once they're all set up, the speed limit for the bridge will be 60 miles an hour for all vehicles. That's the current speed limit for passenger vehicles, but for commercial trucks, it's 55. Work is expected to be done by June, and intermittent lane closures are expected in the meantime. In addition to the new speed limit signs, radar speed detection devices are also being installed. Those will warn drivers if they're going too fast. The end of the split speed limit on the Atchafalaya Basin Bridge follows a similar move in Tennessee, which recently ended the split speed limit on a stretch of Interstate 81. The Colorado DOT has installed 13 new variable speed limit signs on Interstate 70 between Georgetown and Idaho Springs. The signs come with new technology that automatically adjusts the limit based on congestion, traffic conditions, and adverse weather conditions. Data from the Federal Highway Administration show that variable speed limit signs can reduce rear-end crashes by 65%, fatal and injury crashes by 51%, and total crashes by 34%. The California Highway Patrol is reminding truckers to give their brakes a break. In a social media post, the CHP Donner Pass Commercial Vehicle Enforcement Facility showed a picture of a recent truck fire that resulted from brakes overheating. The CHP noted that westbound I-80 just past the Blue Canyon exit is a long negative grade, and that effective compression braking will allow commercial truck drivers to safely travel down the mountain, alleviating stress on the braking system. A reminder for you Arizona drivers out there, a commercial enforcement blitz is underway along Interstate 10. We told you earlier this month about the two-day blitz dubbed Operation Full House, which got started on Tuesday. It's concentrated around the Ehrenberg Port of Entry near the California state line. The Arizona DOT says more than 50 inspectors are taking part, targeting driver qualifications, hours of service compliance, and looking for safety violations. And finally, the Owner-Operator Independent Drivers Association has revamped its Fighting for Truckers website. The newly redesigned site makes it easier than ever to reach out to your elected representatives in Congress about current issues that matter to you. Jay Grimes, OOIDA Director of Federal Affairs, says it's got everything the old site had, plus more.
Yeah, right. If you're an OIDA member, if you've signed up to receive our call to actions on fightingfortruckers.com, you just got to, enter in your personal contact information, which is really just your name and address, and it'll send a letter automatically to your lawmakers. You don't have to necessarily go out of your way to look up your lawmakers. It'll send the message to them. And the great thing about it is we try and make it easier by putting together messages, but anyone can edit the message to make it to say what they want to say. And this has been a feature we've had in place for the last few years and have really, I think, gotten great feedback, great participation, because it is really simple and quick. But this week we've launched the new fightingfortruckers.com website, and it's got a really great look to it, just as easy as before. But in addition to contacting your lawmakers, we're also going to have a whole lot more information on the specific issues. So if you're on the phone with a congressional staffer or a lawmaker, if you're out meeting with these lawmakers, you can have the latest data, the latest information, talking points to make your voice heard.
Check out the new site for yourself at fightingfortruckers.com. That's Landline Now News for today. I'm Scott Thompson.
Thanks, Scott. Congratulations to Marty Ellis of Carl Junction, Missouri. He's received the OOIDA Safe Driving Award for 30 years of safe, accident-free driving. That's the equivalent of a car driver going 225 years without causing a single accident. The OOIDA Safe Driving Award program is sponsored by Shell Rotella, and if you're interested in receiving the Safe Driving Award, you can find a link to more information at landlinenow.com. Next, I'll discuss research into hydrogen combustion engines with Dr. Thomas E. Briggs Jr. and Ryan Williams of the Southwest Research Institute. I'm Mark Reddick, and this is Landline Now.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to like and subscribe. If you want more content, go to landline.media to get updated news, information, and archived editions of our show. Once again, that's landline.media.
Penske owns and operates some of the best-maintained vehicles on the planet. Our used trucks come with a 5-year maintenance report and pre-sale inspection. So if you're in the market for a top-quality pre-owned truck, look no further. Search our inventory today at PenskeUsedTrucks.com.
Control your toll costs and eliminate tolling headaches with Prepass Tolls. Prepass Tolls means toll volume discounts. Just one invoice for all tolls and fewer violations. Call 877-878-5970 or go to prepass.com.
Ready to make more money? Use a better load board. For a limited time, get 50% off TruckStop Load Board Pro. Just go to truckstop.com/go and enter promo code READY2023 when you purchase Load Board Pro.
Buckling up keeps everyone safe on the roads. Learn more at www.sharetheroadsafely.gov. Paid for by FMCSA.
What is the fuel of the future in the trucking industry? It sounds like a very theoretical discussion to have, but in fact, with the government pressing all the time for fewer and fewer emissions from large trucks, it's a discussion we need to have. You're listening to Landline Now, and I'm your host, Mark Reddick. Welcome back to the program. For some time, the government has been pressing for battery-driven electric trucks, and by now, many truckers will be familiar with the shortcomings of that technology. Others have already moved on to the use of hydrogen-based fuel cells to generate electricity, a new kind of new fuel hybrid. But the Southwest Research Institute, a scientific organization based in San Antonio, Texas, is looking into another alternative, and it's one that uses some existing technology in a new way to achieve a close-to-zero-emission truck, and that is hydrogen combustion. Among the people working on the project are Dr. Thomas E. Briggs, Jr., an Institute engineer, and Ryan Williams, manager of the Institute's Powertrain Engineering Division. I spoke with the two men recently to discuss their research, how it might translate from the lab onto the road, and some of the practical concerns that truckers might have. Well, first of all, I'm wondering if you would talk generally about hydrogen as an alternative to diesel fuel. What are the upsides and downsides, in a broad sense, to the use of hydrogen?
I think the main upside is really the carbon content. So we're looking to eliminate CO2 emissions and avoid the more catastrophic consequences of global warming. And so we need to find energy sources that are carbon-free to do that. And hydrogen is a carbon-free fuel. And so that is the main upside of moving to hydrogen, that we eliminate the CO2 emissions part of things. As far as the downside, I think the real struggle, and then maybe we'll talk about this a little bit later, is the energy density of hydrogen can't keep up with liquid fuels in general. It's liquid fuels are kind of the gold standard in terms of energy per weight unit, and so that's where maybe there will be some challenges in just making sure that you can get the range and the mileage that you need to out of hydrogen. But in terms of some of the alternatives, the low carbon alternatives, hydrogen is a pretty attractive source. It's got a very high energy per mass density or energy per mass rating, but it's really the mass per volume that is the problem.
We've heard about the possible use of hydrogen, and this is something that there's been a lot of talk about in trucking in terms of using it to power fuel cells, to power an electric motor in a large truck. But you're talking here about hydrogen combustion directly powering the drivetrain. Why would combustion be superior, say, to using it to power fuel cells? What are the relative advantages and disadvantages there?
So I would say that we're still in a development stage to where we don't know what the final right answer would be, if there is one. If we look at a fuel cell today, all the manufacturers are working on developing. There's billions of dollars of investment across the heavy-duty trucking industry to develop fuel cell powertrain. On the plus side, it's zero emission at the truck. You make water, but you don't burn anything, so you don't make nitrous oxide emissions. You don't have any of the pollutants, which is a big concern when you go into really landlocked areas like Port of Long Beach, things like that. The downside is today they're pretty expensive because they use a lot of expensive materials. They're not made at scale. there's a lot of pretty complicated manufacturing processes that just don't have this century of development that we have with the IC engine. So they've got some good, but they've got some challenges today. Those are mostly engineering challenges. We probably can address those over the years, but it takes time. If we look at putting that into an IC engine, we're looking at existing technology. So the benefit is we've already got manufacturing capacity. We know how to make these things. We're going to make them effectively, reliably. The engines last for 1 million miles easily. Service, you can go to any, garage and the mechanic is still going to know what to do. There's not that much change on the engine. And so for the operator, have a problem? No problem. Any place is going to be able to work on this just like they would on a diesel truck. There's not that much difference. But we do have nitrous oxide emissions. What we're seeing with our work here is they're going to be really, really low, cleaner than a diesel truck. So you're still way better than you are with anything on the road today. You're probably still going to be better with anything that's going to be on the road coming after 2027 with the new NOx regulations, at least no worse. And so it's not zero, but it's really, really close to zero. The other thing that's really going to matter at the operator end, whether it's a fleet or an individual owner operator, is what's the cost per mile. We don't know that one today. If you look at a fuel cell, somebody's pitching a fuel cell, they're going to point out that the peak efficiency of a fuel cell typically looks a little higher than the peak efficiency of the engine. If you dig in deeper, it's usually at a relatively low power compared to the maximum rated power of the fuel cell. And so for a heavy duty application where you're running at 50, 75% load, the engine may actually be more efficient. But over time, those are going to kind of leapfrog each other as technology develops on both sides. So we don't know where total cost of ownership, cost per mile, whatever metric you want to use will end up. That's where we see, and we're working on both at our facility, we need to push both forward to figure out, is one a winner or the other, or is it going to be different markets, different sectors would pick one or the other for other reasons?
Okay. In reading some of the material on this, it appeared to me that what Southwest Research Institute is doing is retrofitting a traditional diesel truck to run on this hydrogen. And that seems to be, if I'm understanding what y'all are saying correctly, and you've kind of referred to this a little bit, but I'm wondering if you can talk about some of the specific modifications that have to be made to a traditional diesel engine in order to use hydrogen as a fuel, because I know that other fuels have been tried, for example, liquefied natural gas that requires an entirely different structure in that engine. What's got to be done to use hydrogen?
Yeah, so there are actually a couple of different pathways. So you talk about the liquefied natural gas, and people are probably familiar with the HPDI technology, and that has been applied to hydrogen as well and is perfectly applicable. So there are maybe fewer changes to the base diesel engine to do something like that. We have in our approach here, we actually started with a natural gas engine, so the natural gas version of the X15, just because it had a few more of the necessary components. The main things that you really need is you need a new injector to get the hydrogen to the engine, and in our case, we're doing a spark ignited combustion, so you have to add a spark plug. Which is why we started with the natural gas engine, because I had the spark plug there already. And then apart from that, it's smaller changes. The engine block and the cylinder head are generally fairly similar to the diesel. You may have to change out your turbocharger because you need more air going through the engine to burn hydrogen. And then on the vehicle side, it's really just the fuel supply and some of the additional sensors and systems that we've put on for safety as well.
Ryan, I wanted to ask you about one thing, something you mentioned earlier. You're talking here that you're modifying as I understand it, a liquefied natural gas engine, correct?
Not quite. So if you're thinking of liquefied natural gas as the high pressure direct injection, this is more similar to like CNG trucks, if you've seen those. So anything that runs gaseous natural gas, it's similar to that technology. So the engine inherently looks a lot more like a gasoline engine. So you're adding fuel, you're igniting it with a spark, and it burns. Whereas with the HPDI and some of those liquefied technologies, you're still burning the fuel like a diesel engine with a compression ignition. So that's the primary difference with our engine here.
Yeah, so I was going to say, if we step back and kind of look across the whole industry, so we're doing this specific project for a specific reason. So we picked, natural gas engine because it's the minimum number of things we have to change on the engine, which for our purposes was an advantage. If we'll look at what's under development across the industry, I can't give specifics or names, obviously. There's a bunch of different approaches that each OEM basically says, what do I have and what makes sense for my business planning. And so, we talked about the HPDI injector technology that Westport offers, and it's gone into a variety of different engines for different OEMs over the years, typically using liquefied natural gas as the fuel. Some companies are working with that because, as Ryan said, you can basically just take off the LPG tank, put on hydrogen tanks, and same thing basically works. You still have some diesel fuel because you're using that for the ignition, so you still have some CO2 emissions. And so, again, when you get into regulatory issues and things, we're still not totally locked down on that, but it's an easy way to do things if you're already working with that injector system on other trucks in some market. Other OEMs are basically, okay, what if I pull out my injector, put a spark plug in there, I'll do port injection, kind of like an older gasoline engine, or maybe figure out how to put a direct injector in, more like a gasoline direct injector. Doesn't look exactly the same if you look at the part, but conceptually the same idea. For some of the OEMs working in the medium duty space, they're looking at, I'm going to do a new cylinder head that looks more like what you would build for a gasoline engine. They've got bigger volumes. They can do that there. That gives them some performance advantages, but you've got to sell a pretty large volume of engines to do that. So when you get to the 13 to 15 liter class, you don't sell that many engines economically. That's kind of a tough thing. So you can do very little to modify the engine, or you can do a lot to modify the engine. And there's reasons that you may choose to do one or the other if you're going to go into production with it. It really depends on how many do you think you're going to sell, how does that fit into your manufacturing plan and other stuff. But in the end, there's relatively straightforward ways to do this, no matter what OEM you're talking about, what kind of truck you're going into. The biggest change you're going to see at the truck level is this big old hydrogen tank system that goes onto it in place of the diesel tanks. The rest of it basically looks like any other engine, just a few components have been changed out.
Something I wanted to ask both of you here, kind of broadly before we get into some other topics. Why did the Southwest Research Institute decide to pursue this particular area of research? With everything going on, the big thrust right now on the part of the government is toward electrified trucks. So why did you decide to pursue this avenue of research?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And really, the way we see it is that it's going to take a whole array of technologies to fully decarbonize transportation. There is no one technology that is the silver bullet that's going to be perfect for every application. And so when we see legislators and regulatory bodies talking about banning any one specific technology, that's where we get concerned. And so that's really why we launched this program, just to show both to the industry and to the public that hydrogen engines are also a viable pathway to decarbonization.
I've been talking with engineer Dr. Thomas E. Briggs Jr. and Ryan Williams, manager of Powertrain Engineering Division of the Southwest Research Institute, a scientific organization based in San Antonio, Texas. And the topic is the Institute's research into hydrogen combustion to fuel large trucks. We'll be back after the break with more of our conversation. I'm Mark Reddick, and this is Landline Now.
Are you tired of the IRS following you around like a dark cloud? Call 888-557-4020 and get your life back.
Dispatch, I picked up that load of steel, so I'm ready to roll.
Sounds good. Remember, we're getting paid by weight, so make sure to use a cat scale.
I wouldn't weigh anywhere else.
Forget miss accuracy when you truck on a cat scale.
It's tested and proven. Burn 2.1% less fuel when you balance all wheel ends with Centromatic. Call 800-523-8473 to get the OOIDA discount.
Landline Now. Welcome back. Before the break, I was talking with Dr. Thomas E. Briggs Jr. and Ryan Williams of the Southwest Research Institute about their research into the use of hydrogen combustion to power large trucks. We continue now with that conversation with an exploration of some of the practical aspects of hydrogen-fueled trucks.
They may not be the perfect technology for every application, but particularly for long-haul trucking, it seems to be a really good fit. Especially where it gets very difficult to get enough batteries on a vehicle to get the range that you need. And so that was really our main motivation, was just to say, let's not rule engines out yet, and let's work on this technology. And as we talked to a lot of our customers who are major OEMs and suppliers, they were kind of the same mind that we need some more development and some more research in this area before we start to pick the winners and the losers in the technology race.
I'd like to ask you both about some of the concerns that truckers on the ground have, especially the one-truck operations, which is a lot of our audience. And one of the big concerns that these truckers have with electric trucks is range. Right now, a diesel-powered truck might go 1,200 to 1,800 miles on a typical fill-up. Do you have any idea yet of what kind of range a hydrogen combustion truck might have?
We've been looking at that, and that's one of the reasons that we and the OEMs we work with like hydrogen. We don't do a lot of work with fleets, but we talk to fleet operators, and they run into the issue with electric trucks that they're getting way less range than they need on a charge. Then you get into, where am I going to charge it? Or enough charging stations? A whole bunch of stuff you have to deal with. Again, with time, can that be fixed? Yeah, probably, but it's a challenge today. Hydrogen, probably realistically, from your audience would be, it's going to be in between. You can think of it, roughly 1 kilogram of hydrogen is kind of like a gallon of diesel fuel. If you look at, okay, how much space would I have behind the cab on like the Class 8 semi with a sleeper cab option? Might have to go to a slightly longer frame, but I can put enough hydrogen capacity on there that I think you could say I could get 800 miles of range, out of a tank system that doesn't look insane. And again, we're not putting anything down on the frame rails where the saddle tanks would have gone. Could you do it? Yeah, you have to worry about, you got to have some armoring on there because now you've got hydrogen, which is a little bit different than diesel fuel. If you've got a side impact, can be solved, and some truck OEMs in Europe would look at doing that because of the way their trucks are laid out, since they're typically box trucks. That's the only place you got. Again, maybe you get to like 1,000 miles of range if you really pushed and put tanks everywhere. With gaseous hydrogen, that's probably where you start to say, okay, now it's just getting ridiculous in how much I put on there. So if you've got, saddle tanks on both sides with the extended tank options, a liquid fuel truck is always going to win on total range between fill-ups. It doesn't look too tough from what we're looking at in terms of packaging onto the truck to at least give enough range that you can drive as far as you can in your legally mandated hours before you have to fill up. I lived in the Midwest, and so I know a lot of truckers like to cross certain states that have really high fuel taxes. And so again, you'd have to plan your stops carefully for that, probably, compared to having a little more flexibility. But you can get a reasonable range that you're not having to stop and fill up halfway through your hours or something. You're going to be stopping because you need to for other reasons.
I want to talk about something that you mentioned in there. You said something about armoring and saddle tanks and so on. We all grew up with the film of the Hindenburg going up in flames, and people kind of famously regard hydrogen as explosive. Have you done a lot of looking into, I mean, you mentioned the armoring, but what kind of safety features would be needed on a truck to prevent that kind of incident out on the road?
So the nice thing about hydrogen is we started looking, or the industry started looking at this back in the early 2000s. You may remember there were a few hydrogen cars that BMW had put out. And so that was really when the industry started to look at safety for hydrogen. And since then, the safety standards and the regulations have really matured quite a bit. So there's a lot out there. It's not like it's completely new ground for us. And so in terms of, the tank structure and, safety of the tanks themselves, we're fairly confident there. Like Tom said, there's maybe some concerns about impact and things like that. But one of the nice things about hydrogen is that it dissipates. If you do end up with a leak, it does dissipate pretty quickly. So it's not like a liquid fuel where maybe it leaks and pools up on the ground and poses a risk there. So if you do have a leak, as long as you don't ignite it right away, it seems to, the hydrogen just tends to dissipate quickly. So the main concerns are just on structure and overall integrity of the tanks themselves, and that regulation is pretty mature.
There's some other things you have to do. Crankcase ventilation for diesel trucks has typically been pretty rudimentary compared to what we've had on passenger cars. As we go to the 2027 emissions regulations, that's getting more sophisticated anyway, just to keep the NOx emissions down, because you actually get quite a few emissions from the crankcase if it's just an open vent. For hydrogen engines, we go to active ventilation. Basically, you want to make sure you're pulling hydrogen out, that you don't build up hydrogen in the crankcase. Technology is already out there. The suppliers have parts. We're integrating it onto our truck. It's straightforward enough. The OEMs will all have that kind of stuff done. Intake manifold, you don't want to have a carburetor or something of that level where the whole intake manifold's full of hydrogen, because then you do have something that's potentially explosive if you have a backfire. Again, nobody's building engines like that. So the places that you really have a risk are in the engine itself. And that's just, we don't design the engine in a way to be dangerous. We make sure we design in the safety features there. There's some cool stuff on tanks. It's been a few years, but some companies have worked on tanks that the fiberglass wrap actually changes color if there's any, material stress. So you can visually see the tank is weakening. So there's a bunch of stuff like that the industry's already figured out, that we'll figure out what makes sense, what doesn't. Again, most of the tanks on these trucks are going to be up behind the cab, where they're pretty well protected from most collisions. And so, in as much as you can make anything really safe, it looks pretty safe from the typical kind of collisions you would see on the road. There's been some high profile stuff over the past 12 months where there have been some fires when hydrogen vehicles are being refueled inside a building. That's actually one of the more challenging things, is when we're doing work here in our labs, we have to do a lot of work on ventilation, because hydrogen, like Ryan said, is really light. It rises up to the ceiling. So down at floor level, there's no hydrogen, even if we had just opened up the tap and let the hydrogen flow under the room. It rises really, really quickly, but you can build up a lot of hydrogen in a closed space up at the ceiling level. So you have to make sure you're ventilated there in a building if you're doing maintenance. So shops are going to have to worry about that. The laboratories we work in, we have to worry about that. On vehicle, there's hydrogen sensors in the cab under hood to make sure that any place you could get a buildup, you detect it and you do something to prevent there from being a safety issue before you get to that point. So for the most part, it's stuff that we know how to deal with, and we're building in. It's fun to watch Hindenburg documentaries. Most of the fire was really just the fabric material was highly flammable. The hydrogen played a role initially, but then it all disappeared pretty quickly. And so, again, we need to do the same thing, that if you have a hydrogen leak, let it go up into the sky and it goes away. And so it's really watching for the enclosed spaces where hydrogen can build up and you actually run into a problem. And that's mostly part of the vehicle and the engine engineering that the people making these things are going to do.
I want to go to another practical concern that truckers have. When everybody was looking at liquefied natural gas a few years back, it's a cryogenic fuel, and that was going to require all kinds of specialized training or equipment in order to simply refuel a truck. If you look at electric trucks, of course, you're talking about the length of time necessary to refuel, with the air quotes there. Right now, a trucker can basically refuel the rig themselves. Is there special training or care needed to handle the hydrogen refueling? Is this something someone can do themselves, or is this something where you really need to have someone else doing the fueling for you? Or have you gotten to that point yet?
We haven't dealt too much with the refueling from what we've seen, and there's a lot of work going on there, and mostly in standardizing the refueling process. The big concern is the high pressures that we're dealing with during refueling. And, so it isn't as simple as just dropping the hose into the tank and letting it fill. But for the most part, there's a lot of automation and some smarts that, the vehicle is talking to the pump back and forth and monitoring pressures and fill rates and things like that to the point where that's pretty transparent to the driver. I think the end goal is that the driver can show up as long as he's had the training to hook up the hose properly to his vehicle and make sure everything is sealed tightly, then he should be able to just push the button and refuel, and most of that is taken care of by the smarts of the system itself.
The real world experiences in California, 3,000 some light duty hydrogen vehicles, mostly in the LA, San Francisco area right now, and 30 some refueling stations. Those are all self-serve. The hydrogen nozzle, it's basically a big fancy locking mechanism that positively locks onto there, and just the driver comes up, they hook it up. There's a lot of sophistication in the refueling system, and that's still under active development to make it more reliable and to handle the higher flow rate you need to fill up a heavy duty truck. So they're talking about, water cooled nozzles because you're pushing so much flow through there that it's going to get hot. But again, that's all transparent to the driver. They just hook it up there, it's a twist lock or something like that. It electrically communicates and says, yep, everything's good. And it lets the pump start putting fuel in. So it should be able to be self-serve. You're not going to need safety equipment or anything like that. You'll just need to be accustomed to using a different kind of a fuel pump than you use today, based off the experience we've got right now.
Just one last question, gentlemen. What state of development would you say your technology's at? And kind of what I'm getting at is how long might it be before we actually see something using this technology out on the road?
So there are actually limited production of hydrogen engines in Europe already. JCB is a construction equipment manufacturer in the UK. If their press releases indicate, and we've confirmed they are limited production of hydrogen IC engines. They're going into prototypes and test things right now. It's not something you just go to your dealer and buy, but they're getting pretty close to where they can do that. There's some other companies in Europe that are kind of at that same stage where they're doing limited production today for certain applications. If we look here in the US, we do more than just the research stuff that we're talking about today. We're one of the biggest certification labs in the country for heavy duty trucks and engines. Looks like we're probably talking between 2027 and 2030 when we see most of them come to market, one of these. And so OEMs are kind of going right into that process over the next 12 months, which puts them online that these things will be on the road around 2027 to 2030. Again, depends on the OEM and how aggressive they're going after this.
Again, I've been talking with Dr. Thomas E. Briggs Jr. and Ryan Williams of the Southwest Research Institute about their research into the use of hydrogen combustion to power large trucks. We'll be back in a moment. I'm Mark Reddick, and this is Landline Now.
Capital Reman, your leader in remanufactured diesel engines and components, is celebrating its 10th anniversary. Let us help you avoid costly downtime and repairs by visiting capitalreman.com today. Use code OOIDA10 to receive your member benefits.
Stock up on Howe's Diesel Treat, the nation's most trusted anti-gel. And to be safe from the harshest winter conditions, make sure you have Howe's Diesel Lifeline on hand, the fastest-acting gelling rescue product. Available nationwide, Howe's products are designed to keep you rolling through the toughest conditions. Visit houseproducts.com.
Attention professional drivers, are you behind on your tax filings? You owe money? Integrity Tax Relief Group frees drivers from IRS trouble. You watch the road, we'll keep an eye on the IRS. Call now. 855-976-4291.
Since you started, what you've loved about trucking is the freedom. Heading out on your favorite route, a good driving song, and thinking about truck insurance. Well, maybe not that last one. That's why we're here. At OOIDA, we have a full range of truck insurance products, expert advice, and great customer service, helping you get the right coverage for your operation. Go to OOIDA.com, because your job is to drive. Our job is to help with everything else.
Landline now, welcome back. We've seen a number of cities and states take aim at idling trucks in recent weeks. We'll break down who's doing what and where now with the help of Keith Goebel of Landline Magazine in our weekly state legislative update. Keith, how you doing?
Scott, doing well. I don't really concern myself with that city stuff. It's got to be at least the state level to be worth.
Yeah, I know. You've got standards, and you will not deviate from those. That's what we appreciate.
I have to eliminate certain things.
Yeah, that would be a little much if you started covering cities and counties and everything in between. We may never.
But we do have folks here that maybe they'll cover those occurrences.
True.
Not that it goes uncovered, so
Absolutely.
we'll still make sure we do it.
Well, we'll talk about what you did cover here in your recent piece on landline.media. It takes a run at half a dozen states currently looking at truck idling rules. And as I said there, this seems to be one of these issues that has kind of gained some steam, or at least gained attention for some reason, I guess, in recent weeks. This is we've got quite a few states looking at this.
Well, it's an annual issue. Some years you might see more than others. But whenever you do have states with legislation on the idling issue, they don't always go anywhere. But yeah, we've got multiple states that are in the process of moving efforts through, and one we'll do here in a moment where it's actually been signed into law. But yeah, kind of starting with Colorado. They've got a House bill there, and it's scheduled for a committee hearing this week. So maybe that will, yay or nay as far as that particular effort there in Colorado. But yeah, as folks I'm sure who travel Colorado well aware, they already have a uniform idling standard. Now, that standard prohibits a vehicle from idling for more than 5 minutes within any 60-minute period. Now, local governments, as is under current Colorado law, they are prohibited. They cannot enact a resolution. They can't enact an ordinance that is more strict than what the state has as far as its idling standard. But that would change with this House bill that's been offered up. It would permit local governments, they could enact an idling resolution, they could enact an ordinance that is at least identical to, but it could be more strict than what the state idling standard is.
Yeah, this is one of these issues, too, I think, if you are in one of these states where some of these rules are being considered, this is an issue, I think, that lawmakers would benefit from hearing from truck drivers about just why some of these rules and making them stricter would cause problems and don't make a lot of sense on the surface. So, again, if you're in one of these states where one of these rules is being strengthened or possibly being strengthened, really a good idea to reach out to your lawmakers there on the state level and help them understand this issue, because it is a bit confusing, I think, for people that don't know anything about commercial trucks. You teased the state in which a bill has now been signed into law. That state is Idaho. What are they doing there with regards to truck idling?
Yeah, the governor recently took action on legislation that went through the state house pretty straightforward. I guess you would consider it to be more of a truck-friendly idling rule there in the state of Idaho. Yeah, this new law, it's putting into a statute that a commercial vehicle. It doesn't have a weight limitation on it. It just strictly applies to commercial vehicles, that they would be allowed to idle if they're using the heating or their AC when they're at rest. So, you would say a common sense addition to statute there. It includes another provision that would permit idling when the truck is parked. If they are, if they have perishable commodities, pharmaceuticals, again, permitting them to idle if that's what they're hauling. It is worth noting there is one other provision in there that we're talking about permitting idling in certain situations. If it's in a residential area, if the truck is parked in a residential area, it would not be permitted. So essentially, you can do it in those special circumstances, but it has to be at certain places away from residents.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
And it takes effect the 1st of July.
Yeah.
So, for Idaho, for the most part, you would have to assume those folks who are wanting to rest and maybe have some AC to help cool off, it takes effect this summer.
Yep, changes coming there in Idaho. Some more flexibility there in Idaho. Less flexibility possibly in Washington State. I know the Trucking Association there has pushed back against an effort to adopt California-style rules there. And appears they won. What's going on there in Washington State?
Yeah, well, obviously concern, we talk about from time to time, once you establish a precedent in one state that other states will look to it to consider. And then you've got the added component of if you have a nearby state or a neighboring state that legislators will say, well, this is what they're doing here, and this is what we need to consider. And that essentially was the case in the state of Washington, looking to California and their idling rules that they have in place for trucks. What if it's a truck in excess of 10,000 pounds? You're limited to idling for up to 5 minutes. The big point of contention is something that Washington Trucking Association communicated with those that they are helping out in this as far as educating lawmakers is, for one, adopting California regulations. Again, they were not approved by the California legislature. It was a group that put in place the rules in California, and then just simply adopting them in Washington, pointing out that Washington is unique and factors there don't warrant adopting that change, again, in the state of Washington. One of the points that was brought up is that, trucks, they don't want to idle. They would rather be doing the job, going down the road.
Yeah.
It'd probably be more effective if, in this case, the state of Washington looked into addressing inefficiencies in the supply chain.
Detention time, things like that, for sure. New York State, Utah, Vermont, 3 other states that are looking at or have looked at this issue. You'll have to go to landline.media for updates on those stories, courtesy of Keith. Let's talk truck parking real quick here, Keith, because you wrote a story on this as well. Legislation in, I think, 4 states that are looking at truck parking and the issue there. We'll focus on a couple here. Georgia, what's going on there with regard to truck parking?
Yeah, as far as topics go, truck parking is not something that we generally see year after year at state legislators, but it's been picking up some steam. In Georgia, we saw towards the end of last year, there was a group that got together. It was a Senate study group, and they were looking at the overall what was described to them as being a truck driver shortage. But as a part of that group's recommendations that they have provided to the legislator for this year for consideration was concerns about truck parking. The Georgia House here has voted unanimously to advance a bill that would set a statewide freight and logistics implementation plan. It's a 20-year plan, but included in it are such things as improving, making more commercial vehicle parking available.
And real quick here, Minnesota, looks like we've got a couple bills in the House and Senate, identical bills there that would go toward a truck parking improvement program.
Yeah, essentially just looking to support, show support for improvements for truck parking access and its availability, implementing this truck parking improvement program. These bills are both We talked about there's one in each chamber. They're identical bills, which allows lawmakers in both chambers to discuss the same issue at the same time, hopefully, so that if it starts to advance, they won't have to spend as much time on it, on the issue overall. But they're still in committee yet to be considered.
Reach out to your lawmakers about this issue as well and make them understand why it is so important to get behind truck parking. Keith, a pleasure as always. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for having me.
That was Keith Goebel of Landline Magazine, and that's our show for today. We thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to like and subscribe. If you want more content, go to landline.media to get updated news, information, and archived editions of our show. Once again, that's landline.media.
I'm a dad,
a son,
a husband,
wife,
I'm a writer,
photographer.
I farm.
I'm a veteran.
I love old cars, fishing,
my kids,
chrome,
and I am
a professional truck driver.
And together we are OOIDA.
OOIDA was founded by truckers to stand up and speak on behalf of truckers. We've done that by combining the individual voices of our members into a single, powerful voice. Protecting your interests, defending your rights.
Join us!
Make your voice heard. Join OOIDA, the Owner-Operator Independent Drivers Association. Call 1-800-444-5791 or visit OOIDA.com.